Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Anson here. So we're back with a brand new video, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at component props. Now, quite often, whenever you are writing out your application, you're going to have nested components inside a component. This is a really good example of a nested component. We have our main app component right over here, and inside this app component we have two components, also known as child components. The navigation component is a child of the app component, and so is the register form component. Okay, now navigation and register form are obviously independent, but they are both child components of the app component. Now let's say if I needed to pass in some data into these components. Let's say, for example, if we had a users page that's responsible for displaying all users. Well, typically what you would do is you would have a separate page that would render all user components. So let's say if you want to render 10 users. You basically want to do a dynamic render of all of those 10 users. And for each user, you want to pass in their own corresponding properties. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at an example, obviously, because that's how it'll help us better understand component props. So we're going to create a new component. I'm going to call this user.js, and I'm actually going to use a class-based component. So first, let's import React from React, and let's go ahead and use the export default because we want to export our component. Now, instead of using the function keyword like we've been doing for the past couple videos, we're going to go ahead and use the class keyword because we want to create a class-based component. So we're going to name our component whatever we want. So user. Now this next part, we need to extend the component class that is part of the React module. So since we didn't import component directly, we can just reference it from react.component. So the next thing that's important with our class-based component is we need the render function, or method rather, because it lives inside the class. And this render method is equivalent to our return function. So we need to put all of our component logic inside here. So we're gonna have the return keyword and then a pair of parentheses, and then we're gonna wrap all of our component structure inside this div. And for now, I'm just gonna go ahead and use an h1 tag. This is going to be a user component, so it should have a name for the user. So I'll just say Anson. Let's do an h2 tag, and we'll do language JavaScript, and let's do a p tag reactjs developer. Okay, so we're going to import this into app.js. So import user from components/user. So I'm going to go ahead and actually just remove these two components because we're not going to need them for now. And I'm just going to render the user component. Okay, so you can see that we have our user component. I open up the dev console or the Chrome tools, you can see that we have our component right over here. Okay, so now let's say we want to pass in some data from our parent component down into the child component. So we're basically passing down properties because this app component is the parent component and the user component is the child component. So right now we have data that's just hard-coded into our component, and you definitely don't want that. One of the many reasons why you would use components is for reusability. You create one user component that represents a user, and then you can reuse it over and over and over again. If you just hard-coded data like this, you would have to create a bunch of different components for each individual user, and that just defeats the whole purpose of using React. And you're not going to be able to have a dynamic application because you might have, let's say, 100 users that you want to display on a page. Well, how are you going to display all those 100 users if you're hard-coding everything? So the idea is what we're going to do is we're going to pass in component properties. And the way we do that is in between user and this / right over here, we're just going to go ahead and give a property a name. So let's say if I want to pass in the name, then I'll just do name equals, and I'll just say Anson. The next thing I want to pass in is language. So we can type language, and then we're just going to say JavaScript. It might seem very similar to HTML attributes, but they're actually component properties. So we'll also do job, so reactjs developer. Okay, so now, let me actually move this here. Okay, so now we have our properties passed in. So how do we actually reference the properties inside our child component? Well, since we're in a class-based component, we need to implement our constructor, which is going to take in one argument called props. This props itself is an object. If we were to console log it, you would see an object that has all of our properties as key value pairs in the props object. Now, since we are implementing the constructor, we actually need to invoke the superclasses constructor. In our case, user extends react.component class. So the component class itself is a superclass constructor. If you don't do that, you're going to get an error. As you can see right over here, must call superclass constructor in derived class. So we're gonna just call super and then pass in props. Now if I save and let me open up the dev console, you're gonna see we have object, and you're gonna see that says reactjs developer. language JavaScript, then name Anson. Okay, so now to actually render the data that's from the props, what we need to do is we need to use string interpolation to actually process the values of each property that's inside this props object. So since we're in a class, we're going to reference this.props, and we're just going to reference the prop name, so name. And notice how we are wrapping everything in between curly braces. The reason why is because if I were to just do this, if I got rid of the curly braces, and if we look at our document, you can see that it literally just says this.props.name, but that's not what we want, right? We want the actual value of this.props.name. So we need to interpolate that by wrapping it between a pair of curly braces, just like this. Now if I save, you can see it says Anson. We're gonna do the same thing for language. So this.props.language. There you go. So let's go ahead and create one more user component, and then I'm going to show you guys how to do this with a functional component. So let's just say we have Jack, and this guy is a Python developer, and his job title is probably Django web developer. So we have Jack, okay, and let's create one more component. It's very, very simple. And you can imagine that we probably might have more users. So obviously copying and pasting multiple users over and over again is not ideal. What we want to do, and we're going to do this later on, is we're going to dynamically render multiple users, okay? But don't worry about that for now. Just you want to be a Java developer, and we'll do Spring Boot developer. Okay, so we have 3 user objects. Okay, now one thing that I should mention is right now we are directly referencing props, okay? But technically these properties should belong to the user component, but in no way are we actually defining these properties in a way that it correlates to the user, because right now we are referencing this.props and props are passed in from the parent component. What we want to do instead is we want to actually take the properties and attach those properties to the state of our component. We're not going to go in depth on state right now because that's a little bit more advanced, but just know that there is a property called state for our class-based component, and you can reference it by saying this.state, and it's basically just an object. And when our component first gets rendered, this constructor is going to be invoked, and then what we're going to do is we're going to set the properties inside this object literal. So for name, we're going to set it to props.name, language, props.language, and then job, props.job. So now if I console log the state object, and I'm going to console log it right before we have assigned it the value, you're going to see that it says undefined, and then it gives us the actual updated value. So now instead of actually referencing properties inside our component, we can actually just reference this.state, and you can see we have our properties. So for example, I can reference name for here. Instead of this.props, we can do this.state.language, and we can do this.state, and you can see it this.state.job. And if I refresh, you're going to see that we have the same values. So it definitely is good practice to set the state with specific properties that you want for your component. Okay, cool. So hopefully that part makes sense and why you should update the state with your properties instead of just manually referencing this.props. Okay, so before I end this video, I'm going to go ahead and create one more component called post. And this time we're going to make it a functional component. I'm going to show you guys how to pass in a property into a functional component. It's very easy. So we're going to export default function, call this post. Now inside this parentheses, we're going to pass in an argument called props. Literally the same thing as this one. Now this time, we're going to return. We're going to wrap everything inside a div. And then now we can directly just access whatever properties we want. So let me just use an h1 tag, and we'll just say props.title, and then p tag props.content. And I know I'm not updating the state of our functional based component. That's because we're actually going to use React hooks later, and that is for a more advanced tutorial. So I know it seems kind of hypocritical, but don't worry. For functional based components, we're just going to leave it like this for now because we're going to actually need to use a hook called useState in order to update the state of our component. And that's for a more advanced video. But just for this video, because you guys are just starting out, don't want to overwhelm you guys with too much. Let's just pass in post. Let's just say hello world, and then content. I love Node.js. Okay, so we need to import post from components. There we go. Hello world, I love Node.js. And you can see that we are referencing the props right over here. Okay, so hopefully this video helped you guys out with understanding component properties and why you should use them. And I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace.